This is the Panasonic Lumix 14mm F2.5 Mark II, and it's a pancake lens, so as you can see it's quite small, and it has the model number H-H014AE. So there's some variation in the model number of this lens, and I think that just depends on which country or which market the lens was produced for, but I don't think there's any difference in the lens itself. This lens was announced in September 2014, but the first version of this lens, the Mark I, was announced in September 2010. It weighs 55 grams and its length is 2 centimeters or 2.05 to be exact. So that's 2.05 protruding from the camera once it's actually attached to the camera. So this end bit which goes into the camera is not considered as part of the length of the lens. It has a filter thread of 46 millimeters. And I think it's quite good for a pancake lens to have a filter thread, because there are a lot of pancake lenses that don't actually have filter threads. It doesn't have a lens hood thread though. So if you wanted, you could attach a lens hood to the filter thread, and then instead of having a cap which goes on the lens itself, you could have a cap which attaches to the lens hood. It has a maximum aperture of f2.5 and a minimum aperture of f22. And the aperture can be changed, so you're not stuck with one particular aperture setting, which is the case for a lot of other pancake lenses. It has 7 aperture blades, and its diagonal angle of view is 75 degrees, and the closest focusing distance is 18 centimeters. It also has a focus ring, as you can see here. It's an electronic focus ring, and I think that's quite good for a pancake lens, because a lot of pancake lenses don't actually have a focus ring. And another thing which is quite interesting is that it does have electronics to communicate with the camera. So a lot of pancake lenses don't actually have any electronics, which means it can tell the camera what its focal length is, as well as passing on some EXIF metadata, and the camera can use this information for both stabilization as well as adding the metadata to the photos and videos that are taken with this lens. The only disadvantage of this lens that I can think of is that it doesn't have a lens hood thread. So if you did want to attach a lens hood, you would have to find a lens hood which attaches to its filter thread, which is 46 millimeters. And then, as I mentioned before, you just attach the lens cap to the lens hood as opposed to the lens itself. The advantages of this lens is that it's small and it's light. It's only 55 grams and it's quite bright at f2.5, and it has a minimum aperture of f22, and the fact that it has electronic contacts here so you can communicate with the camera, that's again rare for a pancake lens. And it has a filter thread and also a focusing ring, and it's a relatively wide angle lens at 14 millimeters. So in my opinion, this is the best single focal length pancake lens that exists. So there are other pancake lenses, but they do have more limitations. So for example, they might not have a filter thread, or they might not have a focus ring, or they might not have electronics, or they might be quite heavy, or they might not have a variable aperture. Whereas this one seems to have all the necessary things to function as a proper lens, but still only weigh 55 grams. And if you want to compare this to other micro four third pancake lenses, one comparison would be to the Olympus body cap lens, which is 15 millimeters, and it has an aperture of f8. The Olympus lens weighs 22 grams, so it's obviously lighter than the Lumix lens, and it's also smaller, as you can see. It's only 9 millimeters, which is less than half the size of the Lumix one. But it has a maximum aperture of f8, and that's a fixed f8, so you can't go to higher apertures or lower apertures, so you're just stuck with f8 for everything. And the closest focusing distance on the Olympus one is 30 centimeters, whereas on the Lumix one is 18 centimeters. And the angle of view on the Olympus one is 72 degrees, whereas on the Lumix one is 75 degrees, since this is a 14mm lens as opposed to 15mm. So you get a wider angle of view with the Lumix lens. And then the Olympus lens doesn't have any electronics, so there you can see the back of it. So when it comes to stabilization and EXIF metadata, you actually have to enter the details for the Olympus one into the camera, whereas with the Lumix one, it will pass it along to the camera automatically. So there's no additional manual work for the photographer when using the Lumix lens. The Olympus one doesn't have a filter thread, and it also doesn't have a focus ring. It has this lever here, which you can set to 3 different preset focus distances. So again, the Lumix one is more flexible in that sense because it has a focus ring. And you can also use the autofocus from the camera. Since it has the electronics, you can also communicate with the lens and not use the focus ring at all. So this is something which is not possible with this completely manual lens. So there's a lot of advantages to the Lumix lens over the Olympus body cap lens. So in that sense, I think the 14mm is a complete lens from Lumix, and even though it's a pancake lens, it's very good. And I can't think of any pancake lenses that are better than this for fixed focal length lenses. Another lens worth comparing to this lens is the AstrHori 14mm F2.5. I don't have that lens, so I can't show it, but that lens is slightly heavier at 99 grams, whereas the Lumix one is 55 grams, and is slightly bigger. So the AstrHori one is 2.2 centimeters, whereas this one is 2 centimeters, or 2.05 centimeters to be exact. The AstrHori one has a maximum aperture of f4.5, so it's less bright than the Lumix one. And its closest focusing distance is 23 centimeters, whereas on the Lumix one it's 18 centimeters. And the filter thread on the AstrHori one is 55 millimeters. So aside from the fixed focal length pancake lenses, another lens to compare this to is the Panasonic Leica 15mm f1.7. Although that's not a pancake lens, but it's actually really small and light, so it only weighs 115 grams, which is twice as heavy as this one, but it's still relatively light. And its length is 3.6 centimeters, so twice as big as this, but still not that big. It can still be used as a small lens, and it has a maximum aperture of f1.7 and a minimum aperture of f16, but it is more expensive, and that's a proper lens. So I don't know if that's a good comparison, but if you're just looking for a 15mm lens, then that lens is better than the pancake lens, because it's obviously substantially brighter at f1.7, whereas this one is f2.5, and that one has a lens hood thread and everything else that a normal lens has, but it's not as small and light as this one. And the image quality of the 15mm f1.7 is higher than the image quality of this, but it's 15mm, so the angle of view is tighter than the 14mm, and it's not as small and light. So you get a better lens, but you pay more for it, and there's some differences in terms of the angle of view and the size and weight. If we compare this lens to pancake lenses that are zoom lenses, then one lens to compare it to is the Olympus M.Zuiko 14 to 42mm f3.5 to f5.6 electronic zoom lens, which is what I have here. So here you can see how small this is. This is the front of the camera, and you can see how much it protrudes. And it only opens up after you turn on the camera. And this one has a maximum aperture of f3.5, whereas the Lumix one is f2.5. And the closest focusing distance on the Olympus one is 20 centimeters, whereas on the Lumix one is 18 centimeters. And it has an electronic focus ring and an electronic zoom ring as well. Although the zoom ring on this one is more like a lever than an actual zoom ring, so it doesn't rotate all the way. It just pushes a button to zoom in or zoom out. And one more thing about this lens is that it only has 5 aperture blades, whereas the Lumix lens has 7 aperture blades. So the background blur and bokeh on the Lumix lens should be smoother, and the bokehs should be more round. And this one also has a filter thread, and the filter thread is 37mm. And what you can do is you can get an automatic lens cap for this lens, so that as soon as you turn on the camera and the lens extends, it will open up, and that's called the LC-37C. You can also get a normal lens cap for it if you want to, but the advantage of this is that as soon as you turn on the camera, the lens is open, and when you switch off the camera, the lens cap closes automatically. So it does have some advantages over the Lumix one in that sense. Now the other thing is, because it works with an electronic zoom as opposed to a manual zoom, which most lenses use, you can actually mount this camera somewhere and use it almost like a PTZ camera, so you can use it remotely to zoom in and zoom out, which is something you can't do with lenses that don't have electronic zooms, because this lens actually comes in a non-electronic zoom form as well. So actually let me show that. So here is that same lens, or almost the same lens. So it's 14 to 42 as well, and it has the same aperture, so f3.5 to f5.6, but instead of having a electronic zoom, you have a manual zoom. So you turn this, so it's a mechanical zooming in and out that you do with this lens. But this lens isn't a pancake lens, so I'm not going to compare it to the Lumix 14mm, because I'm just considering pancake lenses now. But that lens also exists in a manual zoom form, so that version wouldn't be good for using it remotely as a PTZ camera or a PTZ lens. Another lens to compare the Lumix 14mm f2.5 to is the Panasonic Lumix 14 to 42mm f3.5 to f5.6 power zoom, and that lens is almost identical to the Olympus lens. So that one has power zoom as well, the same as what Olympus calls electronic zoom, and that one has the same aperture, the same focal length. Everything is almost identical, the same closest focusing distance. The size of that one is slightly bigger, but apart from that, they have the same filter thread size. So everything is almost identical. The only thing I would say that lens has, which the Olympus one doesn't have, it has the optical stabilization built into the lens, which the Olympus lens doesn't have. But I think the Olympus cameras have so much better camera stabilization that any stabilization in the lens is irrelevant. And also with that lens, the optical stabilization won't actually work if it's put on an Olympus camera. So it has to be on a Panasonic camera. But if you're the type of person who just wants to buy Panasonic lenses, there is that zoom lens, which is the equivalent to the Olympus one as well, which you can buy. Now, Panasonic has one more zoom lens, which is quite interesting, and that's 12 to 32 millimeter, as opposed to the other zoom lenses, which I mentioned, which were 14 to 42. So the 12 to 32 gives you a wider angle, which in my experience has been more useful than having 14 to 42. And the other thing about that lens is that it weighs 70 grams, so it's more close to the Lumix one. So the 14mm Lumix one weighs 55 grams, whereas the 12 to 32mm lens weighs 70 grams. So that one is also a pancake lens, and its thickness is 2.4 centimeters, so it's quite small, almost as small as this one, a few millimeters longer, 4 millimeters longer to be exact. But it has a maximum aperture of f3.5 and the closest focusing distance of 20 centimeters. The filter thread is 37 millimeters, and that one does have a manual zoom ring, but it doesn't have a focus ring. So if you want to focus manually, you have to either use a slider on the camera screen or just use autofocus. So that lens isn't really good for manual focus. And that lens also has optical stabilization, but it doesn't have an on-off switch to switch off or switch on the stabilization. And the stabilization will only work on Panasonic cameras. So if you want to switch on or off the stabilization on that lens, you have to do it through camera. So that lens, they've taken away the focus ring, they've taken away the on-off button for switching stabilization on and off in order to make it really small and keep it as a pancake lens. The one thing I would say about the 12 to 32mm is that it's sharper than the 14 to 42mm when compared to both Olympus and Panasonic. So personally, if you're going for a pancake zoom lens, I would recommend the 12 to 32 despite its disadvantages and lack of focus ring and the lack of on-off switch for stabilization and its peculiarities, because I think the 12mm wide angle is quite useful. Also, it's substantially lighter, so it's only 70 grams, and it has a sharper image quality. So there's a lot of advantages to that zoom lens if you want to go for a pancake zoom lens. But for fixed focal length lenses, I don't think there's any equivalent to this Lumix 14mm F2.5. I think this is the best single focal length pancake lens that there is. And there's a 20mm pancake lens from Lumix as well, but I think that one makes some noise when you're focusing. So I think that one isn't as good as this one when it comes to video recording. And also I think the angle of view is too tight. So it's good for street photography, but for video recording, I think the wider angles would be more useful, such as 14mm or even 12 or 10mm. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions about this lens or if you want me to compare it to any other lens. This is the box that it comes in, so I'm gonna unbox it quickly just so that you know what actually comes in the box. So here's the manual for it. I mean, there shouldn't be much in the manual, but I'll just open the first page so that you can see there's nothing special. So it just mentions the lens caps that comes with this and how to attach the lens or the filter. And it does mention a few filters here. And then here is the specifications for the lens. And the warranty details. And similar things for different countries, so US, Canada, and then it goes into different languages. And this is the lens itself. So this is the back of the lens. And this is the front of the lens. And that's all that comes in the box.